Beware of tall vampire ladies, because today marks the release of Resident Evil Village, the year's most anticipated horror game. Based on the early reviews, it looks like Capcom has delivered yet another winning entry in the franchise that dates all the way back to 1996, and I, for one, could not be more excited. To help celebrate this exciting launch, I want to take a look back at the best and worst reviewed games in the entire Resident Evil series, according to the old school critics. What games are going to come out on top? Well, find out now as Electronic Gaming Monthly ranks Resident Evil. By the year 2000, Resident Evil had already established itself as one of Capcom's most reliable franchises. Not only did everybody love the PlayStation trilogy, but Code Veronica had just proved that the series was ready to make that jump to the next generation. It felt at the time like nothing could stop the franchise's momentum. And then came Resident Evil Survivor, a light gun style game that brought that winning streak to an abrupt end. Now I say light gun style because Capcom decided to rip the light gun out of the game at the last second. Resident Evil Survivor was released in the wake of the Columbine school shooting, which spooked Capcom enough to remove the light gun support that was found in the Japanese and European versions of the game. But even if you ignore that terrible decision, Mark argued that the game was bad for a whole host of other reasons. You can't strafe, can't look up or down, you turn way too slowly, and the game has a horrible habit of auto-aiming and moving the screen around to where it thinks you should be looking. The other critics agreed, saying that this is the franchise's first major misstep. With an average score of just 4.2 out of 10, Survivor is EGM's worst reviewed Resident Evil game. One thing that you're going to notice about this list is that Electronic Gaming Monthly loved the Resident Evil sequels, but hated most of the Resident Evil spin-offs and side stories. I suppose it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that that includes Resident Evil Gaiden, which literally translates to side story. This was the ill-fated Game Boy Color installment that proved that some franchises were meant to be 8-bit. Mark started his review by saying that if the horrible PS1 Resident Evil Survivor game was a slap in the face to fans of the series, Gaiden is a swift kick in the nuts. He hated the bland, lifeless backgrounds, the unmarked locked doors, and the lack of ammo. That last gripe was especially annoying because you need to kill the zombies to collect essential items. John liked the game a little bit more than Mark, but still complained that what you're left with is an agonizingly generic 8-bit Nintendo-era fetch quest adventure game with very little variety or originality. With everybody disappointed, Resident Evil Gaiden averages a terrible-looking 4.2 out of 10. Three years after taking the light gun out of Resident Evil Survivor, Capcom put it back in with the release of Resident Evil Dead Aim. This was a PlayStation 2 shooter that probably should have been an apology for screwing up the first game, but the EGM critics weren't impressed. For what it's worth, Mark gave the game a much higher score than either Survivor or Gaiden, and even praised the game for getting the atmosphere right. He also thought that the new stealth mode was an interesting idea. Crispin wasn't impressed, mocking the other critics' long-winded reviews. Snore, snore, huh? What's that? Sorry, but the near-total lack of horror in the survival horror gun game bored me plumb to sleep. EGM's review crew may have concluded that it's way better than Resident Evil Survivor, but the reviews tell a different story. Resident Evil Dead Aim managed to eke out a still pretty terrible 4.3 out of 10. Speaking of sequels that suck, our next game is Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2. If you're unfamiliar with the Outbreak series, this was Capcom's first, but definitely not last, attempt to take the Resident Evil franchise online. The result was a mixed bag of ideas that didn't quite come together in the first game. So many hoped that Capcom would listen to the criticism and make sweeping changes to the sequel, which was released just 13 months later. James gave the game a 5 out of 10 and complained that the second Outbreak has all the same problems. You can only carry 4 items at once, the AI is pathetically awful, and you still can't use voice chat. You're stuck with the same damn macros to communicate with your buds. Only Timmy from Lassie would be able to understand you. What's that, boy? Jim is being eaten on the hospital roof by a shirtless man with an axe? Mark and Christian didn't like the game much better, which is why Resident Evil Outbreak, file number 2, comes in 11th place with an average score of 4.8 out of 10. We already know that EGM didn't care much for the sequel, but I think it's fair to say that they were a little bit more forgiving when it came to the first Resident Evil Outbreak when it hit PlayStation 2 in 2004. You can really sense the editor's frustration as they try to wrap their head around the dubious online decisions. But seeing as this type of multiplayer game was still relatively new, they were much more forgiving. In fact, Mark heaped a fair amount of praise on the game, noting that Resident Evil Outbreak is absolutely gorgeous. Its fully 3D environments allow for dramatic camera pans and zooms, yet still somehow pack in all the detail of Resident Evil's traditional gameplay. Branching paths, tons of unlockables, and secrets galore encourage replay. Obviously, the big problems that all of the editors complained about was the communication, or lack thereof. As James mentioned in his review of the sequel, the game uses only a few different macros, which forces the player to guess what they need to do. Yeah, that's annoying. But Chris still managed to find a silver lining in his review. Single-player action redeems the faulty online setup with 5 unrelated scenarios in which you really have to work with the AI characters to succeed. He ended up giving the game a surprisingly high score of 7 out of 10, which really helped to boost the average up to a 6.3, making Resident Evil Outbreak the first game on the list to have an above-average score. Way to go! In an effort to not be too redundant, I've decided to only include the first releases of each game. You see, about half of the Resident Evil games that EGM reviewed over the years ended up being ports that were virtually identical to the original, often with similar scores and almost the exact same write-ups. Resident Evil Deadly Silence, on the other hand, poses an interesting question. Is it possible for a port to have enough new content to warrant being included on this list? In the case of this Nintendo DS game, I decided the answer was yes. Sure, it's a handheld port of the original Resident Evil, complete with the same crummy voice acting. But I think there's enough new and unique in this version of the game to warrant being included on this list. Shane had another question in mind. It's time to ask yourself whether you really need to play through Resident Evil again. Sure, the game's a modern classic that helped to birth the whole survival horror genre. But if you want the consummate Resident Evil experience, tackle the lushly revamped GameCube edition. The ever-present mansion map makes navigating too easy, and the first-person challenges where you have to stab enemies with the stylish feel tacked on and cheesy. Milkman liked it more than Shane, noting that it's actually a pretty impressive handheld title, and the new stuff gives Deadly Silence some legs. Not essential, but worthwhile for anybody who hasn't played the original Evil in ages. Yeah, that's far from a ringing endorsement, but Deadly Silence does manage to squeeze by with a so-so average of a 7 out of 10. After a few failed attempts at bringing the light gun genre to Resident Evil, Capcom finally found the right concept and venue for this idea. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles was one of 2 on-rail shooters released on the Wii, and the EGM editors were mostly impressed. Giving it a 7.5 out of 10, Nick argued that Chronicles isn't quite a light gun game nor a first-person shooter, but rather a whirlwind tour of the original trilogy. It's also a surprisingly meaty game, and having a second player gunning alongside allows you even more time to shoot up the environment for hidden goodies. Series fans will devour it as an excuse to flesh out the Resident Evil canon, but it features enough casual slaughter of the undead for anyone to enjoy. Michael was less enthusiastic. I find it just a little funny that Sega's classic light gun series House of the Dead has way more life than Umbrella Chronicles. Sure, it's great to take a gun-toting trip through the Resident Evil saga, but the actual creature killing lacks the ghastly whimsy of the HOD games. The editors also complained about the terrible voice acting and cheesy cutscenes, but come on, those are just par for the course. Even with Michael's lower score, Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles still managed to average a score of 7 out of 10. Alright folks, we're halfway through our look at the best and worst Resident Evil games, which means that we're finally to the point where all of the games are either good or great. According to EGM, that cutoff line was Resident Evil 0, which was released in the year between Resident Evil 4 and that Resident Evil remake. This was an unexpected surprise for many, as it originally started its life as an exclusive for the Nintendo 64. And though it may have been announced 5 years earlier and came out on a completely different Nintendo system, the EGM critics were still impressed. Mark called the game formulaic, but felt that Capcom still pulled it off better than anyone else out there. The razor-sharp visuals and lifelike backgrounds add to the chilling atmosphere that make Resident Evil games worth playing. It's all about the glorious decay of dusty floorboards and darkened secret labs that create that wonderfully spooky feeling. He also liked the cooperative elements of the game, though wished that Zero would have gone more into the backstory rather than giving us a lame new plot. Che not only liked it more than the other editors, but started his review off by saying that Zero is the most fun installment of the entire series. In addition to the strategies introduced by zapping back and forth between characters, the new weapons give this Resident Evil refreshing ways to dispatch zombies and leeches. Lame new story or not, Resident Evil 0 still manages to average an impressive 8.3 out of 10. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis has a bit of a reputation for being the worst of the original PlayStation trilogy. It's not a bad game per se, but definitely a noticeable step down from the stellar Resident Evil 2. And even with a strong score of 8.6 out of 10, there's still a tinge of disappointment from the reviews. A great example of this comes from John, who gave the game an 8.5. On one hand, Nemesis is a beautifully crafted example of its genre, with excellent presentation and wonderful set pieces that'll make you jump. On the other hand, it's a collection of lost opportunities. Chris gave the game a higher score, but even he agreed that Capcom should have kept Nemesis as a side story. While Resident Evil 3 is perhaps the most visually stunning entry in the series yet, I kept wishing that there was more of it. Che summed it up this way. The wide variety of monsters and, of course, the omnipresent Nemesis makes this Resident Evil a truly frightening experience. Still, I'm waiting for Code Veronica in a true 3D environment. Yeah, don't worry, Che, we're getting there. With an average of 8.6, Nemesis is the lowest scoring entry in Resident Evil's PlayStation trilogy. Before all the sequels, spin-offs, and remakes, there was just Resident Evil. The original game in the series was first reviewed all the way back in the May 1996 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, at a time when nobody had any idea just how big or influential the franchise would become. Looking back at them now, you can't help but notice that a lot of the reviews revolve around convincing the reader that it's not like that other survival horror game. Sushi X explains that at first glance, Resident Evil may appear to be a clone of Alone in the Dark, but in reality, it's a totally new experience where the player must fight for his or her life in a horrifying setting. He concluded that as PlayStation titles start to expand into the next realm, Capcom leads the way by bringing players a great adventure with an unbelievable story. Mark went even higher than Sushi, noting that Resident Evil was one of his most anticipated PlayStation games. As a serious gamer, I've had my share of kiddie games and have been waiting for a title just like Resident Evil. It has a great plot, an adult theme, and more action than you'll be able to deal with. Andy, on the other hand, was the lone critic who didn't give the game a 9 or above. At first look, Resident Evil is beautiful, with detailed rooms that are all set up in a realistic fashion. When looking closer at the game, I was a little disappointed to find the limitations of exactly what I could interact with. Resident Evil is a visual feast, but the gameplay will turn off some players. Even with Andy's lower score, the first Resident Evil managed to average a scary 8.9 out of 10. That said, it's worth mentioning that when Capcom released the Resident Evil Director's Cut 1 year later, the magazine dropped its score all the way down to a 4.4 out of 10. Yeah, we talked about that on our list looking back at Electronic Gaming Monthly's worst reviewed games of 1997. You should check it out. Six years after introducing the world to the thrills of survival horror, Capcom returned to Raccoon City for the Resident Evil Remake. This was a big step up from the original, both in story and presentation. It not only looked and sounded better than ever before, but it also gave the developers a chance to fix a lot of the problems with the original, including the voice acting. The EGM staff was stunned by how good this game looked, especially when compared to the PlayStation original. As Jonathan puts it, "Cripes, the remake makes the new E.T. look like a steaming bowl of ass gumbo." A handful of familiar hooks keeps the game grounded in the original Resident Evil mold, but it's an otherwise brand new experience. The other John, Riccardi, agreed, saying that when a game is so scary that it makes you want to pause every 5 minutes for a breather, you know the developers have done something right. That's the kind of feeling that you get while playing Resident Evil. The editors agreed that if you didn't like the original, then this remake probably won't win you over. But everybody was impressed by the look and atmosphere of the game. With an average score of 9.2 out of 10, this remake remains one of the best loved Resident Evil games of all time. After being impressed by the first Resident Evil game, the EGM critics were blown away by the sequel. Instead of just being more of the same, Resident Evil 2 built on the formula in just about every way possible. It was bigger, scarier, and more ambitious, offering what many saw as 2 games in one. It was a chance for Capcom to really show off what they had learned, and, as you'll see from the reviews, the developer was more than up for the task. In fact, the game was so good that it actually surprised the review crew. As Dan puts it, Resident Evil 2 thoroughly surprised this reviewer, one who wasn't that wild about the original. The game is horrifyingly intense. The menu system still sucks, but everything else is just about perfect. Sean was also surprised, starting his review by saying that all he can say is, "Wow!" Of course, that's not all he could say, because he went on to explain that everything from the awesome graphics to the layout of the game is flawless. Gone are the days of cheesy actors and horrible dialogue. Now we have incredible rendered sequences with above-average voiceovers. That was just part of the excitement for the critics, who also loved the new locations, the number of zombies on screen, the eerie music, and the additions made to the gameplay. Hell, even Craig, who flat out says that he didn't like the first Resident Evil, ended up adoring the sequel. With an average score of 9.4 out of 10, Resident Evil 2 is easily the best reviewed entry in the PlayStation trilogy. After the critical and financial success of the PlayStation trilogy, there was only one name on the tip of everybody's tongue: Code Veronica. This was the Resident Evil game to watch, not only because it was the first next-generation installment, but also because it was a chance for Capcom to ditch the pre-rendered backgrounds and create gorgeous 3D worlds. We take that for granted now, but that was a big deal back in the Dreamcast era. You don't need to take my word for it, because here's Chris explaining why it matters. What a difference real-time graphics make. Not being able to see around corners, watching as the camera pans to reveal a horde of undead, it creates real tension. I never thought the Dreamcast would have been capable of this level of graphic clarity outside of Soul Calibur. Crispin echoed those thoughts, saying that this is vintage Resident Evil gameplay packaged with 3D visuals so slick that you gotta wonder if PlayStation 2 games could really look much better. Despite some lovey-dovey sappiness, the plot is pure dynamite, and the overall adventure runs longer than past Resident Evil games. While the editors loved Code Veronica, they did complain about some of the trickier puzzles and a few familiar locations that we visit. This was also the first Resident Evil to receive a 10 from one of the critics, boosting the score up to a staggering 9.7 out of 10. For 5 long years, Code Veronica stood as the best Resident Evil had to offer. While spin-offs, side stories, and remakes came and went, it looked like that 9.7 score was simply too high to be topped. It was going to take a special kind of game to impress the critics as much as that Dreamcast installment. Well, as it turns out, Resident Evil 4 was a very special kind of game. In fact, I think it's fair to say that it was the turning point for the franchise. It was the game that ditched most of the Resident Evil cliches and showed players everywhere that you could do something new with the franchise. This was more than a sequel, it was a brand new age for Resident Evil. Mark sums it up this way: forget what you know, or what you think you know, about Resident Evil. RE4 not only brings the series out of its creative rut, it also packs the most refined graphics and gameplay in survival horror since, well, ever. I don't care how sky-high your expectations are. Resident Evil 4 will blow them away again and again. 2005's Game of the Year might have come out just 11 days into it. Milkman also gave the game a perfect 10 and started his review with a bunch of words: abandoned, hopeless, miserable, afraid, outnumbered, underpowered, lost, and handsome as hell. These are the words to describe how I felt while playing Resident Evil 4. And that's just in the first 15 minutes. It's not enough that every person you come across wants to put a pitchfork in you, but should you let Mr. Chainsaw get within striking distance, you'll find out that this is not your daddy's Resident Evil. Yeah, that's for sure. With an average score of 9.8 out of 10, Resident Evil 4 was both the best reviewed game of 2005 and, as Mark predicted, Electronic Gaming Monthly's Game of the Year. Sadly, we'll never know if it could be topped, but I have my doubts. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these EGM reviews. If you know somebody who loves Resident Evil and old school reviews, then please do me a favor and let them know about this video. These types of features take a really long time to research and put together, so any help that I can get to spread the word would really be greatly appreciated. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite Resident Evil game? Do you think EGM got the order right? Or is there a game that you would put above Resident Evil 4? I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back on Sunday with a new episode of 10 Things We Learned This Week. followed next week with even more reviews. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,